it's evening assembly at the convent, and all the nuns are in the hall. And the Mother Superior says, "Ladies, something has come to my attention, and I'm very sorry to announce that right here in the convent, we have a case of gonorrhea." A moment of shocked silence, and then a voice from the back of the room says, "Oh, thank God, I'm so sick of Chardonnay." Okay. I'm John Rafferty. This is the 5th annual Secular Humanist Society of New York Freethought Day brunch. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of Freethought Day, which I hope will become more and more of an important holiday to more and more people in America. Everybody's familiar with the story of the Pilgrims and coming to America for religious freedom so that they could practice their religion. So they came here in 1620, and they established themselves in Massachusetts. And the fact of the matter was, they were practicing their religion freely in Holland. They had left England, went to Holland to escape from the established church in England. They get to Holland, they have all the freedom that they want, and their problem is their children are associating with other children who are not in their religion. And this freaks them out.
Horrors.
So off they go through one thing and another. They come here, they settle in Massachusetts. They were, we think, aiming for Virginia originally. The very famous Mayflower Compact, because only 43 of the original 102 or whatever it was that were on the Mayflower were actually members of their religious sect. The rest were not, and very suspicious of these 43. I thought we were going to Virginia, and how come up here? And they got very nervous. So the Mayflower Compact was really about guarantee. No, okay, don't worry. Even if you're not in our religious sect, you have full rights here in this colony we're establishing, which was fine. Then, in a few years later, another bunch of their compadres arrived, and they immediately started changing things. In just a few years later, in the 1830s, it became necessary, they decided it was necessary to tax everybody for the church, whether they belonged to the church or not. You had to pay for the church. A little while later, a few years later, it became a crime not to go to church and belong. A few years after that, in the 1850s, this may sound familiar, in the year 2013, one of the leaders of the church proposed, luckily it didn't happen, that all the women in the colony wear veils. Wear veils.
Oh, wear veils.
Where have I heard that before?
That didn't pass, but eventually the laws became stricter and stricter until finally, in the 1660s, apostasy or heresy was punishable by death in Massachusetts. Okay? You're also all familiar with what eventually happened. The craziness got crazier and crazier and crazier, and in 1690s we had the Salem witch trials. And 22 people were hanged or pressed to death under stones, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And finally, on October 12th, in 1692, the governor of the colony, William Phipps, said that because I saw many innocent persons might otherwise perish, including 52 people who were right then accused of witchcraft and were in jails. William Phipps decided that from this on, spectral evidence, meaning I see the devil in the corner, or something like that, by the crazy young girls who were, the rock stars of the colony. And he decided that spectral evidence would no longer be permitted in any court in Massachusetts, and that evidence had to be available to the ordinary senses and to reason. And that is why we celebrate October 12th as the beginning, the end of the craziness and the beginning of reason and rationality in America, first time. And within 50 years, Massachusetts and New England became the most liberal, educated, and scientifically oriented section of the country. So, Governor William Phipps of Massachusetts and Freethought Day. Think freely all day long. In 1959, Jonathan Engel's father and 4 others sued the public schools of New Hyde Park on Long Island because children had to sit through a non-denominational prayer every day. And the suit said that, non-denominational or not, that is a promotion of religion. The suit eventually, Jonathan's older brother was the reason for his father being involved in it. Jonathan hadn't even started school yet, just a child. And the case eventually went to the Supreme Court and became one of the most famous decisions in Supreme Court history when in 1962, the board reaffirmed the principle that government has no business promoting religion of any kind, prayer, non-denominational, whatever, none at all. That was being from that background and being photographed for, I just found out 20 minutes ago, 1978. 1978 issue of Life magazine, along with others in his family, for famous constitutional cases, the 200th anniversary then of the Constitution. Jonathan was a natural for a career in law, which he is. And he is a lawyer, I should say. And so,
But don't hold that against me.
Forget about it. No way a lawyer gets off. No. Shakespeare was right.
Okay.
Anyway, but we'll let you go a little while longer.
Okay.
And so he is a lawyer. Got in touch with us a couple of months ago, and before we even drafted him to speak today, he joined the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and he's one of our newest members, and Jonathan Engel.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody to Freethought Day. I know what some of you might be thinking. I had to pay for this. What are you talking about, Freethought Day? This guy's thoughts aren't free. You're right. I suppose they aren't, but I do think that and hope that you will find them to be at least reasonable, if not actually free. And also you get a nice brunch, so come on, it's a good deal. You really can't beat that. My name is Jonathan Engel, and I'm here to talk about specifically, or more generally, about the separation of church and state, more specifically about school prayer, and then even more specifically than that, than what John had mentioned, the 1962 Supreme Court case of Engel versus Vitale. And as also John mentioned, the names are not a coincidence. My father, Stephen Engel, was one of the plaintiffs in the case. Now, the Engel versus Vitale case was a First Amendment case. So we should start. Let's take a look at the First Amendment and see what it actually says about religion. And what it says is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's it. That's all it says. So everything else, what it doesn't say anything about school prayer. It doesn't say everything else is a matter of history and the politics and the culture, etc., that all lead up to the Engel case. And so I'm going to sort of go through that a little bit. First thing I want to do is read from just another section of the Constitution. This is Article 6, Paragraph 3. Come on, you know Article 6, Paragraph 3, right? Okay, no. This is what Article 6, Paragraph 3 says, and it's actually quite important, at least it is to me. The senators and representatives before mentioned, and the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support the Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now, I don't know if any of you noticed this, but a number of years ago, President Bush, the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, was asked if he thought that an atheist could be a good citizen or a patriot of the United States, and he said no. He said no, that couldn't possibly be. But he was obviously not all that familiar with Article 6, Paragraph 3, which says, and he did swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, but I suppose he didn't swear one to actually read it. And what it says is no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Now I want to move on here to a couple of writings, so where we need to interpret. We need to see what was meant by some of these words in the Constitution. And so a good person to start with is James Madison, who became president of the United States, and of course is largely credited with being the primary author of the Constitution. And in the mid-1780s, he wrote a document called Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It's not the zippiest title ever, but it actually is extremely important. And here's the sort of the background. When Virginia was a colony, it had an official church. That's not surprising because it was an English colony, and the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was the official Church of England, and so it was the official Church of Virginia as well. But after the United States declared its independence, Virginia enacted a Bill of Rights that did away with an official church. But by the mid-1780s, there had been sort of an influx of new religions sort of taking hold in various parts of Virginia. And I'm not talking about a bunch of Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and Jews and not even Catholics, walking into Virginia in the mid-1780s. We're talking about Methodists, Baptists, and horror of horrors, Quakers. But you know how some religious folks are about splitting hairs when it comes to their basic religions, and so this actually alarmed some of the establishment people in the state of Virginia. And here's what they proposed in response. They proposed that there would be a tax. They would institute a tax on the people of Virginia to be used specifically to support the Anglican clergy. And Madison wrote this document, the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, in opposition to that tax. And here's what he said. Madison argued that government suffered when religion was established, and that religion suffered when it got too close to government. And that's very important. We're going to see that when we get to the Engel decision, that the justice who wrote it, not only, I don't have to guess because it's in the footnotes too, but you will see that, that he studied Madison very carefully. Madison went on to say, who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of only one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Madison felt that citizens have the right to follow whatever religion they want or no religion at all. And he was a very persuasive person, and the proposed tax was defeated. The next document I want to read from just very briefly here is a letter George Washington wrote to the congregation of the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Some of you probably know the Touro Synagogue is considered the oldest continuing Jewish congregation in the United States. They had written him a letter saying how, wishing him well and how much that they appreciated his service to the country, etc. And Washington replied, and this is part of his reply to the synagogue. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For, happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. So you see what Washington's doing here. In effect, he's taking Article 6, Paragraph 3, which applied to government office holders, and in a way he's bringing it to the level of the average citizen. Remember it's very important to remember to whom he's talking to whom he wrote this letter. This letter was going to a bunch of Jews. They might have been Martians for all most Americans at the time, were concerned. And what he's telling them is essentially the same thing as Article 3, Paragraph 6. There is no religious test in this country for you to be even a citizen. All it takes is that you demean yourself as a good citizen and that give your effectual support to the government on all occasions. And that's it. That's the only requirement. There is no religious requirement for being a good citizen of the United States. That's from George Washington. And I gotta tell you, if I gotta pick a president named George, I'll go with Washington over Bush. So we get into the early part of the country, and prayers and Bible reading were largely part of the school day. We were a much more homogeneous country at that time, and we were also much more of a rural country. So you had, frequently a lot of small towns that had maybe like a little general store and a blacksmith, and they had a church, and a lot of people lived in the farms that kind of surrounded the towns. And if their kids went to school, they went to the church school where they read, part of learn to read by reading the Bible, King James Version. And that was the way, the sort of accepted that was the way things worked in this country. And it did not produce a great deal of conflict, because if you think about it, most of the people belonged to that same church. So, this was all sort of natural to them. But by the time we get into the mid-1800s, there were some things that changed. That change was taking place in this country on a number of different levels and a number of different ways that was going to make this kind of church and school intermingling less and less viable. For one thing, in 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. And in some ways, this changed the way people thought about education and religion. Because prior to that, you could say that the biblical version of how, of biology, of how human beings, of how all animals and plant life came to be on this planet, well, you could say it was scientifically correct. There was nobody telling you really anything different. But then all of a sudden, Darwin was. And actually, the U.S. Education Commissioner in the 1870s, his name was William Harris, he said he thought devotion in school was inappropriate because academic instruction requires critical thinking, whereas worship demands unquestioning faith. And I think that's one of the best examples, even now, today, that's a wonderful example of why these things should be separated. Now, there was other changes taking place in the country as well in the mid-1800s. Demographic and cultural changes. For one thing, we were getting an influx of people from different parts of the world who were not Protestant. Starting in the mid-1800s, we all know about the famine in Ireland. There were a lot of Irish people, mostly Catholic, coming to this country. All of a sudden, we started to get big waves of immigration from all parts of Europe. You had Lutherans coming from Germany and the northern European countries. You had Catholics coming from Italy and other parts of Europe. You had Jews coming from mostly Eastern Europe and other places too. So we were less homogeneous as a country. We were also becoming a more urban and less agrarian society. So people of different backgrounds, this was the time of the Industrial Revolution. So their factories were being built, and there were jobs in those factories, and those jobs pay pretty well, and it's a hell of a lot better than being down on the farm. So people started congregating in what were becoming cities for these jobs. And you had a lot of the immigrants who were coming to this country were also congregating in cities. Frequently, if they had countrymen who were there, they sort of, come on over and we'll help you get a job and we'll help you find out, show you the ropes, etc. And so a question starts to come up. How do you design public education to serve this newly diverse population? All of a sudden, it's not just the little town with everybody of the same religion anymore. Now we're getting cities with people of very different backgrounds and different religious traditions. And so there was a lot of conflict. Getting through the late 1800s into the early 1900s. I won't get into too much in the way of specifics because we've got a Supreme Court case to get to. But there was a lot of conflict. In Cincinnati, some rabbis petitioned the board to stop the prayer, and it was taken out and then put back. And in New York City also, in New York City in the early 1900s, they had sort of done away with the kind of hymn singing and some of the Bible readings, but they were still starting the day with a prayer, a Protestant prayer. And one of the ways that many Catholics reacted to this was that they started their own system of parochial schools. But still, there were a lot of Catholics who wanted to send their kids to public school, and people of other religions, and people of no religion, and there was conflict. Now, I want to move us forward a little bit to an important case in 1943. And in 1943, or just prior to that, the state of West Virginia had put a law in place that said it was mandatory that every student must say the Pledge of Allegiance to start the school day. And some parents sued. They said this was a violation of their religious rights. Now, you might think, at first glance, at first blush, that, they must be objecting to the words under God in the pledge, except that in 1943, the words under God were not in the pledge. That didn't happen until the 1950s, and we're going to get to that in a little bit because that's really actually an important factor in the Engel case. So what did they object to? Well, these were people who were from a particular religious tradition that believed that that kind of pledge could only be made to God, that you could not make that kind of pledge to any secular authority, not even the flag of the United States and the Republic for which it stands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they felt that their children being mandated to say the pledge was a violation of their religious rights. And the court agreed. And I just want to read a little bit from the decision of Justice Robert Jackson. It is enormously important. And I don't know that Jackson ever used the phrase, actually, freedom of conscience. But that's really what he's saying in this decision. That's really what's going on here. It's a matter of him stating that individual Americans have their own freedom of conscience. And this is what Jackson said. If there is a fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. It's extremely important. It was some of the greatest words ever written by the Supreme Court.
Could you repeat that?
Sure. This is what Jackson said. If there is a fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Now, there was another, we're getting into the 1940s and into the beginning of the 1950s, and there was another really important factor that was coming into play now that would be a very important but sort of unstated factor in the Engel case, and that is the Cold War. Because the Cold War was seen, for many Americans, as the fight against godless communism. It was at this time, it's not a coincidence, 1954 is when the words "under God" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance. It was also in 1958 that the words "in God we trust" was put on our paper money and adopted as our official motto. Prior to that, our official motto of this country had been "E pluribus unum," which of course is Latin for "from many come one." And but instead, in 1958, they changed the official motto to "In God We Trust" and put it on the money. I mean, I have to tell you, I prefer "E pluribus unum" myself. I think that you have people in the House of Representatives right now who will tell you that, for example, there's no reason for us to do anything about climate change because in God we trust, because God will take care of it. Human beings cannot possibly harm his great creation, and therefore we can just sit back and do nothing. There is even one particular congresswoman from Minnesota who will go unmentioned, who believes the end times are at hand, and any moment now she's going to float up to heaven. And as the writer Sam Harris has noticed, I don't know if these are the people we want to trust. I don't know to really do things about our future, if they really think there isn't going to be one. But in any event, you can sort of see what's happening here and leading to the Engel case is really a clash of principles in a lot of ways. When the Constitution was first written and passed, it was thought that the Bill of Rights applied only to actions by the federal government. Then the 14th Amendment gets passed after the Civil War, and the 14th Amendment explicitly says, no, the Bill of Rights applies to the states. By 1940, the Supreme Court had held that, no, the Bill of Rights applies to any action by any government at any level. And so people started asserting their rights. People started saying, hey, wait a minute. If the local little government, whatever it may be a school board, maybe anything else, if they're doing something that's violating my civil rights, then I've got a right to go to court and sue. And of course, this was the beginning at this time of the civil rights movement. You had Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. You had people saying, hey, wait a minute. We have our own rights. we're not going to sit in the back of the bus anymore, and we can go to whatever school we want to now. There was this, sort of feeling that sometimes among minority members that they could assert their rights. But on the other hand, the Cold War strongly argued for both conformity and the open expression of religion. The Cold War wasn't, it wasn't really about just being religious or feeling religious. It was saying we're religious, because when we say it, and we say it loud, and we all say it together, then boy, can those commies over in Moscow hear it. So you have kind of conflicting sort of principles that would wind up colliding in the Engel case. And I want to talk about now kind of the lead up to the case. In 1951, the New York State Board of Regents brought together a group of priests, ministers, and rabbis to write a prayer for the schools. Now, you may ask yourself, what is the state of New York doing in the prayer writing business? And you will see that the Supreme Court wound up wondering that too. And they wanted the prayer to be non-sectarian. which is going to be an interesting question too, which is, can a prayer ever really be non-sectarian? But this is what they came up with. This was the Regent's Prayer, and sometimes you hear the Engel case referred to as the Regent's Prayer case. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. And that was basically it. And it raised, several questions. For one thing, it seems innocuous enough, but note that it promotes sectarian notions of monotheism, supernatural creation, and divine response to petitions. And of course, what of atheists? They do exist, and they do have rights, as much as some people would like to pretend that this is not the case. Now, the prayer was recommended to New York State school districts, but it was not mandatory. But if a school district wanted to start their day with a prayer, this had to be the one. And by 1955, only about 10% of the school districts on Long Island were using it, and the New York City schools were not using it. I mean, this was, they knew that this was, ripe for trouble in New York City, and so they were not using it. Now, again, this initiated on Long Island. It's actually the Herrick School District, which is in New Hyde Park on Long Island. It's kind of north shore of Nassau County, surrounded kind of by Roslyn and Great Neck and Mineola, in that sort of area. And the 1940s and 50s brought great changes to Long Island, culturally, socially, religiously. The Engel family moved into Long Island in 1953 from Brooklyn. Like a lot of people, you got to get out of that city to the wonders of the suburbs. And what used to be farmland was being turned into housing. Because you had the returning World War II vets, they were making lots and lots and lots of babies. And so, this farmland was all being dug up and a lot of houses were coming in. And they were bringing in new people. There were some social tensions in the Herrick's area. It had been a largely Catholic working class area where many people sent their kids to parochial school. And now you had this influx of outsiders, many of them not Catholic. And there was a need to raise taxes because you had to build schools to educate all these kids, all these people who wanted to send their kids to public school. And so you had people like thinking to themselves, well, we've been living here for years and years, and all of a sudden you got this bunch of newcomers coming in, and my taxes are going up to build schools that my kids aren't even going to go to. And so there's a certain level of resentment. And of course, fear of change and of others frequently engenders reactionary kind of reactions. So in July of 1958, the Herrick School Board voted to start using the Regent's Prayer to start every day in every class. The lawyer for the board was a guy named Herb Ballin, who I knew his son, played stickball with him. And the board's attorney gave an opinion to the board that this was unconstitutional. He said, I think this is unconstitutional, don't do this is a bad idea. And so, faced with a contrary opinion from their own legal expert, the board took action. They fired him. Which gives you just an idea of just how entrenched this idea was. They were not going to be dissuaded from doing this. Now, many teachers were uncomfortable leading the prayer, but faced dismissal if they did, if they refused to. Kids just sort of, kids, they mumble the words, they just say them. And that's why there were actually some religious people who were against the prayer, because they felt that, it sort of demeans the idea of prayer, which to them was something that was important. And so if kids just mumble it, they're going to think that these words really don't have any meaning. They may actually learn the truth. So, so it became just sort of a rote recitation. Now, my older brother, Mike, is 7 years older than me, and he was in school at the time. And he came home, my father, how was school? What'd you do? Well, we started the day with the prayer. And Dad, the teacher told us how to pray. She said, you put your hands together like this, and you look, I don't know, up at the ceiling or whatever, and that's how you pray when you say, and my father was like, my family was Jewish, my father was Jewish, so we don't pray that way. And just think of it, if you could imagine if there would have been a Muslim teacher in the school saying, okay, kids, here are your prayer mats. This way's east, this way's Mecca. Everybody get down on your knees, put your head on the floor, and then say the Regent's Prayer. It's the same non-denominational prayer, right? But that's one of the key questions. Can a prayer ever be really non-denominational. So, and again, and then what of people who don't believe in God at all? What of their rights? The atmosphere at the time was that such people were dangerous communists who didn't have any rights. But the Constitution said they do. Now, we had a next-door neighbor named Larry Roth. And Larry had two kids who were a little older than my brother Mike. They were in school, Dan and Joe. And Larry was a non-religious person, completely. And he was incensed that his kids were being compelled to pray in school. He thought that religious instruction was the prerogative of parents and not the duty of the state. He contacted the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, for help, and they warned him of the potential repercussions, but said, look, if you decide to go forward, we'll hire you a lawyer. And the lawyer who took the case was William Butler, brilliant man. And he wanted Larry to get as many co-plaintiffs as possible. They didn't want it to look like just a few malcontents who were bringing this suit, if it was going to actually wind up being brought. My father was the first one to sign on. Unlike Larry, Dad was a religious man, but he thought that this prayer diminished religion and was divisive. He also, my parents were very concerned with civil liberties for everybody. I mean, my father felt it doesn't matter if I'm okay with this prayer. If I don't like it that they're making my friend Larry's kids pray, if Larry doesn't want his kids to pray. So he thought that was Larry's right. At first, a lot of other people joined in, but then a lot backed out at the last minute. This was it's hard sometimes to imagine how frightening a thing this was to do. Many teachers, as I mentioned, were uncomfortable leading the prayer. They had been trained as teachers, not as clergymen, but they were intimidated too. Remember, to oppose the prayer branded you not only anti-religion, but also pro-communist. And this was at a time when people deemed pro-communist lost their jobs, were blackballed, and couldn't get another one. So, this was really a frightening thing. So Roth and Engel petitioned the board to end the school prayer. The board will not budge, absolutely not. William Vitale was the board president. That's how the name of the case comes, to Engel versus Vitale. You were wondering who Vitale was, right? He was the board president. And he said, absolutely, you want to sue? You go ahead and sue, but we're not changing the policy. So the lawsuit was started. There were 5 plaintiffs. There was Larry Roth, Steve Engel, Dan Lichtenstein, Lenore Lyons, and Monroe Lerner. And so began the case. Now, local newspapers called the plaintiffs atheistic commies, and there were letters to the editor along the lines of, "Go back to Russia, you Jew bastards," which is very Christian of them, don't you think? Yes, yes, yes. But I think that the furor of the case died down a little bit as the case wound its way through the courts, largely because the plaintiffs kept losing. And as long as we lost, nobody really cared that much. But while the case was pending, there was really a gut-wrenching decision that Larry Roth and Steve Engel and the other plaintiffs had to make, and that was, they said one of the defenses was, this prayer is voluntary. So kids were allowed to actually get up and walk out of the class. But oh my God, what a it was just, now Larry had his kids get up and walk out of the class. And I think, even to this day, this was a source of friction. My father did not have my brother Mike walk out. It was really difficult. He felt that was the right thing to do. And then he just looked at his, 10-year-old son and said, I can't do it to him. I just can't. It's hard enough what I'm doing to my family as it is by dragging them into this case. I just couldn't, I talked to Dad about it. He said, I just couldn't do it to him. I just said to him, listen, say the words, they mean absolutely nothing, and we're going to get rid of it in the court anyway. But it was a really gut-wrenching decision to make for all parents, or I guess at least for many. Now at trial, in the trial in the New York State Supreme Court for the County of Nassau, Attorney Butler emphasized that the plaintiffs were not against religion, they just wanted to keep religious indoctrination in the home and in the church where it belongs. We are actually protecting religious liberty for everyone. Religious liberty includes being able to practice whatever religion you want, in whatever way you want, or to not practice religion at all if that is your preference. That is true religious liberty. It was a great argument, but the plaintiffs lost. And they lost in the trial court, they lost in the appellate division, and then they lost in the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state of New York. But there were two dissents in the Court of Appeals, and one of which made an essential point. I mean, the defense, the basic had two defenses. One was it's non-sectarian, the prayer, and the other is it's voluntary. But one of the judges on the Court of Appeals said in his dissent, an immature child is unable to resist because of his inherent desire to conform. And the Supreme Court of the United States then took the case. One of the reasons why the Supreme Court, they get petitioned to take a lot of cases. One of the reasons they'll take a case is if they see a good dissent. If they see a dissent that says, makes sense, they say, well, maybe this whole issue should be revisited if the dissent makes sense. At Supreme Court of the United States oral argument, Butler said, the very purpose of the Constitution is to protect the minority against the majority, to protect the weak against the strong, in matters of keeping separate forever the functions of the civil and the religious. I mean, it was true that a majority of Americans at that time, probably today, I'm sure, favored school prayer. But rights granted under the Constitution are not subject to popular vote, thank God. And so that was the purpose. So the Supreme Court issued its decision on June 25th, 1962. It was a 6-1 decision written by Justice Hugo Black. It voided the regent's prayer and all alike it across the country. And Black's decision stated, it is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as a part of a religious program carried on by the government. Remember I said the State Board of Regents, what are they doing in the prayer writing business? Justice Black kind of wondered what they were doing in the prayer writing business too. He went on to say, religion is too personal, too sacred, too holy to permit its unhallowed perversion by a civil magistrate. A union of government and religion tends to destroy government and to degrade religion. James Madison, right? I mean, he cites him, so he read it. But remember in the Remonstrance, he said that when religion was, government suffered when religion was established, and religion suffered when it got too close to government. And that's exactly what Justice Black was saying when he said, a union of government and religion tends to destroy government and to degrade religion. It is neither sacrilegious nor anti-religious to say that government should stay out of the business of writing or sanctioning official prayers and should leave that patently religious function to the people themselves. And then we lived happily ever after. Except that we didn't. Actually, what happened then is all hell broke loose. Now, remember, this was front page news. This is front page news all over the country. The hate mail started. And I don't mean a little, I mean a lot. And really serious, nasty stuff. Threatening letters. People protesting outside of our houses, screaming. I mean, here I was a 4-year-old kid, and there are people screaming at me that, I'm going to hell and what they're going to do to me and all the rest of this stuff. At one point, my father, who was a tough guy, boy, was he ever, pulled out a baseball bat, and I'm okay, that's it, I've had it with this. And that's when the cops finally stepped in. When there's people standing on our lawn screaming at us, the cops just went, yeah, whatever. But when my father was going to bash their heads in, they said, oh, wait a second, we better step in and stop this. My father received a phone call at work saying, we've got your kids. Hang up. It was that bad. It was really that bad. It was really that horrible for quite some time. And I had a room, my room in our house was the one closest to the Roth house. In May of 1963, I was 5 years old. And this is one of my earliest memories at all of life, because I was woken up in the middle of the night by fire engines. And I could hear sirens. So I woke up and I looked out the window and I could see lights flashing, and I could even see some flames, because some good Christian youth had decided to burn a cross on Larry Roth's driveway. That's right, a cross burning in 1963, not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, not in Georgia, but on Long Island. And I can tell you it happened because I saw it. I was there and I saw it. So I started school in the following September, 1963. I was 5 years old. And in 1976, I graduated from Herrick's High School. I spent my whole time in Herrick's High School. There was a lot of residual anti-Semitism. I'd say the school was probably about a third Jewish or so. The district, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but I'll tell you what, they buried this case. In all the years I went to Herrick's schools, from kindergarten through 12th grade, I did not get one lesson in the Engel versus Vitale case. You would think maybe that, you know, since the case had originated in their schools, et cetera, and was a big important Supreme Court case, that they would teach it in civics class, in history class, whatever. They did not. I think they were very afraid of what might happen. I think they were still, the emotions were still so raw. They were just really afraid of it. Interestingly enough, I have some cousins who lived further out on the island and went to Syosset schools, and we'd see them on Thanksgiving or whatever, and they'd say, hey, we just got a class in the Engel versus Vitale case, but not us. It wasn't there. Probably saved me from getting the shit beaten out of me, so I don't know. I suppose I shouldn't complain all that much about it, but that's how controversial it was, and that's how controversial it still is. I mean, there's still a lot of people who will tell you, oh, the problems of the schools, you know, so we need a core curriculum. No, we don't need any of that. We just need to go back to saying the prayer in school. And in fact, that was one of the things that was thought by the people who instituted the prayer, by the Vitale and the board. They're thinking that, oh, you know, we have a problem with juvenile delinquency, and so if they say this little prayer, they'll behave better. I don't think they had any actual research behind that, but that's what they felt. So I think, and actually, we know that, you know, I think the decision in Engel versus Vitale, from what I see and read, is probably violated on a number of occasions in a lot of parts of the country, mostly what we usually refer to as the Bible Belt. And you're not going to see government officials, for the most part, say anything to these people. They're not going to say, oh, you can't do that. Because, you know, they get elected, and these people do the electing, and if that's what the people want, they're just going to turn a blind eye. So it takes courage to go against these things. It takes a great deal of intestinal fortitude to say, how do you stop it? How do you have to bring a lawsuit, and it's going to be unpopular, and you're going to be vilified, and it's going to be really dangerous, and it's going to be really, really difficult. And so I think I feel a great deal of pride that my father was one of the people who took this case. You know, years later, when I would ask him, how do you feel about it, you know, that you did it, he would just sort of sigh and shake his head and say, I guess somebody had to. And that's really the way he felt about it. He lived through, he had the scars, he still had the scars, but he felt that somebody had to. And by the way, my mother supported my father all the way. I mean, absolutely 100% behind it. My parents were both civil libertarians. Recently, you know, there was a lot of talk because it was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington in 1963. I said to my mother one day, oh, did you see that show on PBS about the March on Washington? She said, yeah, I did, but you know, I didn't have to see that show. I was there. So it takes real courage, and I think, you know, I feel that we, as a people, owe a debt to people like Larry Roth, Steve Engel, Dan Lichtenstein, Lenora Lyons, and Mike Lerner, because they really put themselves and their families on order to protect the rights for everyone. They knew it was the right thing to do. And before I finish, I just want to recommend just a couple of quick books. I mean, John's book is wonderful. I mean, I got to tell you something. I just finished it. It's insightful. It's funny. It's provocative. It's everything that John Rafferty is, and it's really a great book. But I want to mention that if anybody want to read more about the actual Engel case, the book that I would recommend is called "The Battle Over School Prayer: How Engel versus Vitale Changed America," by Bruce J. Deerenfield. And I just want to conclude by thanking John and the Secular Humanist Society of New York for inviting me here to speak today. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here. And I have a special thanks for any of you. Please, you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to say anything. We'll keep your secret. But if anybody skipped church today to be here, then a special thank you and a shout out to you. Thank you very much.
A short Q&A session because the wait staff is...
Questions or comments? Yes.
When I was going to school a long time ago in a galaxy far away in New York City, we had a program called religious instruction.
Yes.
Is that still in effect in New York?
Yeah, it is. And I remember it too, because I remember being very unhappy about the fact that I had to, when school day was over, I had to go to Hebrew school when school was over, but my Catholic friends got to cut out of school early to get their religious instruction. They used to call it relig. Oh, I'm going to relig. Their religious instruction. And I think it's interesting because it's one of the examples of how it depends on whose ox is being gored, how you look at things. Because a lot of Catholic people came to this country and they didn't like the mingling of church and state when their kids had to say Protestant prayers to begin the day. But then when they started building their own network of parochial schools and wanted official government help from their school, all of a sudden the mixing of church and state, maybe it wasn't such a horrible thing. Yes?
Do you think all the school holidays that fall for religious reasons, do you think that's a violation of church and state?
Well, it might be, but you see, the thing is, there's sometimes practical reasons for doing it, for having holidays. I mean, you have to pick your battles too. I think there are a lot of things. I think, for example, having "In God We Trust on Our Money" violates the separation of church and state very clearly. But is that worth picking your battle for? I'm not sure. I know that there are some practical reasons. For example, with the number of Jewish students in New York City, if the schools would stay open during Passover and had to all of a sudden switch over their cafeterias to providing kosher for Passover, lunches or stuff, it would be a nightmare. So I do think that there are a lot of violations, and that probably could be one. But again, we pick our battles.
Hey, can I
Yes.
interrupt just
Sure.
about "In God We Trust" on the money?
Yeah.
Some of you read Peak well, religiously. Will note it. I quoted the atheist writer Greta Christina, and I do what she suggested.
Oh.
I
Oh,
blot
you
out.
cross it out, yeah.
Every night when I come home, I take out my money, whatever's not.
That's great.
In God We Trust. It's fun.
You can go to jail for that, John.
John, you were starting
You can go to jail for that,
Is there a
John.
town
Huh?
to bring
You can
in
go to jail for that.
No.
I'm sorry. I've
You know
got.
what? I'd love to see. You know what,
Hold on.
Max? I'd love to see the case. You can represent me.
We've got a couple more questions I had to just take. Yes.
Yeah, my question was, when you were starting the lawsuit, was there an attempt to bring in any Christians to help begin the lawsuit?
Well, actually, Lenore Lyons was Unitarian. Monroe Lerner, a secular humanist. Thank you very much. And there was an attempt to bring in lots of people. I mean, they had actually 50 people who said, yeah, I'm with you. And then, when people started realizing exactly what this was going to entail, people started fading away. So, Dan Lichtenstein was Jewish. My father was Jewish. Larry Roth was an atheist. Monroe Lerner, a secular humanist, and Lenore Lyons was a Unitarian. They would have liked to have a lot more people. They would have liked to have some Catholics. But again, people who at first said, sure, that sounds good, when they realized that, exactly how bad the backlash was going to be, a lot of people back. They would have liked to have had more, and people would have wanted to do it, but it was really frightening.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm just curious, if the vote was 6-1, now since there were 9 justices, what, 2 of them recused themselves?
Well, what happened
So
was
the dissent?
Justice Frankfurter, the dissent, again, I wish I had the case with that. I don't remember exactly who did the dissent, but there were only 7 justices deciding because Justice Frankfurter was ill and during much of the case and didn't hear oral argument, so he couldn't sit on the case. And Justice White had just been appointed to the court by President Kennedy, and so, although of course when you count it up it doesn't matter, because even if those two seats had voted against, it still would have been a 6-3 decision. Yes?
Yeah, you referred to something when you were reading that quote from Article 6 that I didn't understand, and I've never heard of that before, so I wish you would explain.
What?
The article refers to there being no required religious test for office holders,
Right?
and something about a trust.
And for any trust.
And what does that mean?
I think it's any appointment, any sort of, so it's not just elected office holders, but any appointment under the government.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a friend who was in the state of Missouri, Department of Health, and every morning they started work with a prayer.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how widespread this is in state and maybe even.
It's pretty wide. There was a case in upstate New York that's winding its way through the courts right now, where a local town government was in Greece, yeah,
Greece, New York.
starting their. I mean, it happens. I think it happens much more than we even hear about, because again, the only way you're going to hear about it is if somebody has the courage to stand up and object and bring the lawsuit, etc. That's the only way we hear about it. So I think it does happen. Again, especially in what we call the Bible Belt, but this case is upstate New York. It happens in a lot of places. Yes?
When an elected officer then brings his own religion to it, as Bush has done, and
Right.
You know, he, of course, it would be saying, I assume, that this is the state doesn't have any ability to stop me from doing my personal religion. But is there a defined thing as to when he's, what his religious, what rights he has as a religious person when he's in the office of the, you know, when he's being, you know, performing
Right.
in office? I mean,
Well, I think you know, there's a difference. I think the sort of the dividing line is a difference between personally held beliefs and the sort of trying to the codification of those personally held beliefs. And one of the things this reminds me of is there's sort of an old joke that says that as long as they keep giving math tests, there will always be prayer in school. But I think it's a joke, but I think there's something real about it too, because you know, nobody, I think what people who are wanting the school prayer, in my view, what they're really saying wasn't so much as we want our kids to pray in school, as they're saying we want your kids to pray in school. Because, you know, nobody's going to, you know, my understanding, I'm not an expert on religion, but, you know, it's hard to live in this country without, you know, picking up a few things here and there of what people believe. And people say, oh, your case, the Engel case, how dare you throw God out of the schools? I said, but I thought God was everywhere. I mean, and not to mention all powerful. How could a little person like me throw God out of school? It's because I think what they're looking for is not so much the actual prayer, and anybody could say a prayer at any time, right? Because again, my understanding, and not being a religious expert, is that God hears prayers, whether they're said out loud or not, no matter where they're said. You don't have to be sitting in a room with a whole bunch of people and everybody saying it out loud in order, I mean, if you believe in these types of things. So I think that's really, you know, the question. You know, I mean, there are a lot of religious people who have deeply held religious beliefs who don't bring it into their public life, or not necessarily, you know, upfront about it, because that's a personal thing that they're allowed to do, and nobody's stopped from doing it. So I really do think that for a lot of people who were pushing for the school prayer, etc., it wasn't so much a matter of we want our kids to be able to pray, because their kids could pray. I mean, their kids could. Nobody's stopping any kid from sitting there and saying a prayer to himself. Nobody can get into the child's mind. Nobody knows what the child, or any adult for that matter, at any time from saying a prayer. So what is it about saying it out loud and everybody, all of us saying it together? That's when it starts to get oppressive. So I think the difference in a way, if I could, conceptually, is that when nobody's saying that if you have brought up in certain religious traditions and beliefs, and that you can sort of apply them to your public life if you're a public servant, etc. It's a question of, now I want everybody else to do it too, that you really start to step over the line. Okay, we have to wrap up? Yeah, okay, I think everybody,
Max for the last
we have to, okay. Max, one last?
Considering the present cause, do you have any opinion as to whether or not the Engel decision will or can be overturned?
Well, my personal opinion is this. I think you've got 3 votes to overturn it, definitely. I think you've got Scalia, my God, would have us all walking around in prayer shawls and everything. You have Scalia, you have Alito, and Thomas, I believe, would definitely vote to overturn it. I think you have 4 votes that would uphold it, and the other 2, Roberts and Kennedy, I don't know. I have a feeling, though, I'd like to be an optimist, and I would like to think that Roberts and Kennedy would vote to uphold Engel, but I can't say that I'm sure. So I think our time is up, right? I guess it's time to go. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.